To protect certain fledgling industries means which are new, okay, which are just growing, which have just started. To protect these industries, the government of country Z banned imports of the types of products those industries were starting to make. Okay, so if these industries were starting to make, let's say, light bulbs, now the country Z has banned imports of these light bulbs. How would that help these industries? Because if you don't import, then local people would have to buy from these industries only, right? Local industries. Whereas if you allow imports, then people may not buy from these new industries for whatever reason. Probably imported products might be cheaper or they may be of better quality. But if you ban imports, then these are the only options you have, and that may help up. Then may that may end up helping these fledgling industries. Okay, as a direct result, okay, the cost of those products to the buyers, the cost of these products to the buyers, basically the cost of basically light bulbs to the buyers, several export dependent industries in Z. Okay, so let's say several export dependent industries means several industries that were essentially just exporting most of their products, and these are the buyers of those products. So actually, these export dependent industries in Z were buying a lot of those light bulbs. Okay, the cost of those products went up. Of course, if you don't allow the imports, then there is no competition, and the cost may go up in case imported products were cheaper, right? So the cost of those products to these buyers, which buyers are several export dependent industries which are exporting, the cost of those products went up. Okay, comma sharply limiting. So it's a comma bar ing. So it's presenting a consequence of the previous clause, sharply limiting the ability of those industries, which is export dependent industries, to compete effectively in their export markets. Okay, since the cost of the input went up, right? The cost of those products to the buyers, so they were buying those light bulbs and probably then doing something with them and then exporting their products. Uh, so the cost went up, and that sharply limited the ability of these industries to compete effectively, okay, in their export markets. So whatever markets they were exporting to, now they are not able to compete effectively. It's this cost going up has sharply limited their ability to compete effectively. Okay, which of the following conclusions about country Z's adversely affected export dependent industries, which means these industries, which of the following conclusions about these export dependent industries is best supported by the passage? Okay, what we know is that the cost of input has gone up, and that has sharply limited their ability to compete effectively in their export markets. Okay, option A, profit margins in those industries, which means these export dependent industries, were not high enough. The profit margins were not high enough to absorb the rise in costs mentioned above. The rise in costs we have talked about, mentioned above, right? That the cost of input has gone up. Now we are saying the profits were not high enough to absorb this rise in cost. They were not high enough. Okay, how can we say they were not high enough? We know that the cost went up and that sharply limited their ability to compete effectively, right? And now it's saying profit margins were not high enough to absorb the rise in costs. Now it's a negative statement. One is that I look at the positive aspect of it, I negate it and see profit margins were high enough. Let's say if the profit margins were high enough to absorb the rise in costs, then yeah, so then it would not sharply limit the ability of those industries, right? Because then they can just absorb the rise in costs and still be able to compete effectively. Oh, so if this is not the case, then actually it's going against the information in the passage. Hmm. So it means that given the passage, we can say that profit margins were not high enough, because if this is not the case, then it contradicts the passage. Oh, so option A is the potential answer. Now, let me pause a bit here. This is a very different way I've gone about answering an entrance question, right? People usually don't really negate the option to C. But this is one way actually you can go about, especially if the options are negative, right? Essentially, in inference question, what we are looking for an option that is must be true, right? That is most strongly supported. So essentially, we are looking to evaluate whether the opposite of this is true or not. If the opposite is true, then this is not must be true, right? If the opposite is also a possibility, is a strong possibility, then we can reject this, right? If I'm asking you to evaluate whether X is true, you can, one way is you can see not X can also be true. So I cannot say that X is must be true, right? So you're looking at whether not X can be true or not. If not X can be true, then X is not must be true. So similarly, in this case, I looked at whether the profit margins could be high enough or not. If the profit margins were high enough, then that would not sharply limit the ability of those industries to compete effectively. That would go against the information. So I can see that not X is is actually going against the information. So not X is not really a possibility. So then I can be sure that X is the case, which is this statement is true. Okay. So take some time to understand the logic. Okay, it may be new for you, but this is one way you can go about option A. Option B, those industries, which is export dependent industries, had to contend with the fact that other countries banned imports from country Z. No, we are not given that. We just know that this country Z has banned the imports, and as a result of that, the cost of these export industries, export dependent industries, has gone up, right? And since the cost has gone up, that has sharply limited their ability to compete, right? So the second statement is telling us why the ability has been sharply limited, because the cost has gone up. We are nowhere given even an indication that other countries have banned imports from country Z. This is wrong. Those industries succeeded in expanding the domestic market. No, no, no. This is just a pure hypothesis you may have, right? We have no information whether they have succeeded in expanding the domestic market or not. Probably their domestic market has remained the same or even has gone down. We don't know. Steps to offset rising materials cost by decreasing labor costs were taken in those industries. We don't know whether they are taking any steps to manage the cost or not. Not given that. They may be taking these steps, they may not be taking these steps. We have no information. Option E. Those industries started to move into export markets that they had previously judged unprofitable. This is actually going in the opposite direction. If your costs are going up, you would move to a more profitable market, not to a market which was previously unprofitable. That would be even more unprofitable now, right? So this does not make any sense. So option A is the answer.